Silence in the hospital. An empty bed reveals an absence that hurts. The hope of a sick person for a visit that never came. The priest, a sacred figure for many, turned his back. Why? The victim belonged to another church. The shock of this refusal echoes down the corridor while that believer's heart silently breaks. What makes us forget compassion and Christian love? A thin line between faith and prejudice is about to be crossed. Get ready to uncover the true story behind this rejection. And you, will you be able to judge without hearing the ending? Leave your comment and stay until the end. I never thought I would face something like this inside a church, a place where I had always found hope, faith, and comfort in the hardest moments of life. But that experience showed me a harsh reality that put into question everything I believed about compassion and Christian love. I was lying on that cold hospital bed, my body weakened by illness, and my soul exhausted by loneliness. All I wanted was the human warmth of a visit, the comforting presence of someone who represented the faith I had always nurtured. But what I received was a cutting silence and a door that closed in my face. When the priest approached, my heart beat faster. I thought that finally someone with words of comfort and prayer would be there to help me face that dark moment. However, in a short time, I realized he wouldn't even look me in the eyes. He knew from the very beginning that I belonged to another church, and in that fraction of a second, his expression changed. Without saying a word, he walked away, turning his back as if rejecting something impure. It was as if an invisible knife had pierced my heart. That man, whom I imagined to be a symbol of love and acceptance, had become synonymous with rejection and prejudice. Cold sweat ran down my forehead, my hands trembled, and a sharp pain invaded my chest. I felt the weight of that rejection in a way that no physical pain could ever reach. That moment froze in time inside my mind, like a scar that recorded the fragility of faith when confronted with imperfect humanity. I felt the absolute silence around me, a silence that screamed louder than any word ever could. The machines by my bed buzzed, mixing with my confused thoughts and the emptiness growing inside me. I tried to understand the reason for that attitude. There was no feud between us, no sin that could justify such treatment. It was only a matter of belonging. I was outside the group, outside the religious symbolism that priest carried in his mind. And although the faith we follow teaches us to love our neighbor without distinction, at that moment, that lesson seemed to have been forgotten. I was not worthy of comfort because my belief differed from his. In those long minutes as he walked away, I felt the invisible eyes of the community upon me. It was as if the entire hospital had become a courtroom where I was the defendant condemned for an invisible crime. My chest tightened, my throat dried, and tears welled up desperately, wanting to run free but hiding between the sheets and pillows. My thoughts spun around painful questions. Does my faith not matter? Am I less human for believing differently? What is faith, after all, if not an act of unrestricted love? I couldn't contain the anguish that grew with each second that closed door isolated me from the comfort I so desperately needed. The cold in the room seemed to grow stronger, as if the environment mirrored the freezing of the small hope I had left. What was expected to be a moment of comfort and unity became an open wound, a renouncement of the human spirit that should unite everyone regardless of dogmas or denominations. Throughout my stay in that hospital, there was an enormous internal battle. On one side, I fought against my physical illness. On the other, I faced the far more cruel pain of exclusion. Many times, I took deep breaths and tried to hold back the tears that threatened to surface, aware that this was not the place to show weakness, even though the truth was exactly the opposite. I was weak, yes, but not because of sickness. I was weak because I felt abandoned in the very place where I had expected to find shelter. I could still feel the distance of that empty religiosity, which values symbols and rituals, but sometimes forgets the true meaning of love for one's neighbor. The cruel irony of an institution that preaches unity and acceptance yet fails miserably when confronted with the diversity within its own faith. And I, in the middle of this contradiction, paid a price I had not chosen. My mind couldn't stop wasting energy trying to find some reason, some sign that justified that exclusion. I reflected on all the times I had gone to church, taken part in masses, prayed, and tried to live according to the teachings of brotherhood and kindness. None of that seemed to matter in that instant. The reality was harsh. I was alone, rejected, marginalized for something that should have been a reason for celebration. My faith. Amid tears and silent sobs, my soul shattered. I felt fear, anger, helplessness, a mixture of conflicting emotions that made me question not only that priest's attitude, but also human nature itself. How can religiosity become a source of prejudice? How can love be limited by invisible borders of churches and differing beliefs? Unanswered questions that echoed in the hospital corridors as my struggle for life went on. In that fragile moment, I realized a bitter truth. Many people face this kind of rejection every day, not only in hospitals, but in many places that should be safe and sacred. People who cry out for empathy but encounter closed doors, scornful looks, and attitudes that wound more deeply than illness ever could. I saw myself as a representative of that pain, of an invisible community that only seeks to be welcomed without the penalty of being different. There were times when I thought of giving up, of leaving faith behind, because it seemed it did not exist for me when I needed it most. But I also knew that would be the greatest defeat for my soul, abandoning the belief that gave me the strength to fight. It was an intense battle, like walking through a desert without water, trying to find answers in a world that seemed to have forgotten the true meaning of collective love. My family and friends tried to cheer me up. They spoke words of comfort and hope, but I still felt something missing. The warmth of spiritual presence, the embracing support of a community of faith. I needed to be seen, heard, loved authentically, without judgment or prejudice. That painful experience marked me forever and ignited in me the desire to tell this story, to expose this wound that few want to acknowledge. Because we need to speak about these human failures within the temples of faith so that we can reflect and change, so that no one else has to feel that devastating loneliness in such a fragile moment. The journey that began in that hospital bed is a real story, built with tears, courage, and deep reflection. I invite you to walk with me through this path, to feel every emotion, to understand every nuance of this experience that shook me deeply, and very likely has shaken many others. And now I ask you, if you were in my place, how would you react? Would you be able to keep your faith and love in the face of such rejection? I want to hear your opinion, your feelings, your stories. Comment, and you, what would you do? And follow this narrative until the end, because the next chapter holds moments that will stir your heart even more. This reflection will prepare us for what is to come. The escalation of conflict, the suppressed injustices, and the fight for respect and dignity that everyone deserves. Don't miss it. I never imagined that a simple visit could mean so much to someone. In the hospital, every moment is a mixture of waiting and uncertainty, where time seems to drag, and every detail carries a weight that, outside those walls, no one could truly understand. I was there, trapped in that bed, my body weakened by illness, but my mind still fighting to hold on to any spark of hope. Each new dawn brought not only the challenge of facing sickness, but also the growing fear of loneliness and abandonment. I hoped that faith, that mysterious force so many carry in their hearts, could be a real, tangible companion during those dark days. The room was small and cold, lit only by the pale light of the sun that filtered through the window. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the almost absolute silence was sharp. There, I had plenty of time to think, to mentally relive every moment, every person who passed by, every gesture that never came. I could hear in the distance the hurried footsteps of nurses, the sound of the machines monitoring my vital signs, and at times the low murmurs of patients and visitors in the corridors. But amid it all, the heaviest burden was the emptiness, the vast space left by the absence of the visit I needed so much, the absence of the priest who was supposed to bring words of comfort, but who simply never came. The hours passed slowly, and I tried to find solace in small things, a friendly touch from a relative, an encouraging smile from a friend who came to see me. But it was hard to replace the lack of that spiritual support which for me was so essential. My heart ached in a way no medication could relieve, an invisible grip that made me relive the moment when the priest, without even looking at me, turned his back and left me alone. I wondered if he realized how much that hurt me, how deeply that rejection unleashed a storm of emotions I could hardly control. On one of those hard days, I came across information that struck me deeply. I was not the only one this was happening to. Other patients from other churches were also being neglected, denied the help that, in theory, should be given to everyone, regardless of the faith they profess. It was as if I had uncovered a much bigger wound, a silent system of exclusion within the very spaces meant to offer care. This increased not only my sadness, but also my indignation. I felt part of something much greater, a collective story of pain and rejection. I began to pay attention to the smallest details, to the whispered conversations in the corridors, to the restrained expressions of people as they passed me by. I noticed there was an invisible line drawn between believers of different denominations, as if that alone was enough to deny someone the basic right of being cared for, of receiving comfort. It was painful to think that even within spirituality, division and prejudice could thrive. This realization made me feel even more isolated. How can love be so preached during Mass, and yet in practice hide in the face of diversity? The physical pain was still there, reminding me every moment of my vulnerability. There was the hospital's coldness that seemed to seep into my bones, the bitter, metallic taste of the medication I had to take, but none of it compared to the anguish of feeling invisible and unwanted. My thoughts came and went quickly. Are my prayers being heard? Does my faith still matter to anyone? At night, when everything quieted down, the tears came silently, almost secretly, so that no one could see them. I felt a knot in my throat so tight, it seemed to choke me, but I forced myself to swallow the pain. Even surrounded by people trying to be supportive, there was a natural distance that only those in such a situation can understand. I needed more than words. I needed presence, a gesture that told me I was worthy, that my faith was valid, that I was not alone. The priest's rejection had left a deep wound, and with each passing day, that wound seemed harder to heal. Loneliness led me on an inner journey of self-discovery. Amid suffering, I began to write about my experiences, my feelings, and the questions that had no answers. Writing became a way to ease the pain, to organize my thoughts, and in a way to converse with myself. That was when I realized how many others might be living through something similar, enduring the same silent exclusion. I received messages and stories from people who, like me, faced invisible barriers and prejudice in the name of faith. That connection with other stories gave me new strength, the awareness that my voice could be the voice of many. Still, I knew that exposing all these wounds would not be easy. I feared judgment, misunderstanding, the uncertainty of what might come next. But I also knew that not speaking up meant perpetuating the pain, meant agreeing with injustice. In the hospital, I saw the fragility of all those fighting for life, and I also saw the strength that faith can offer if it is true, if it is genuine. The faith I believed in should be big enough to overcome any division, greater than any rejection. I wanted my story to be a call for reflection, a provocation for people to rethink their attitudes, and above all, for institutions to truly live out the values of love and inclusion that too often remain only in theory. Through all this time, I held firmly to the hope that even in the face of hardship, love and compassion could prevail, that faith could be an instrument of unity, of healing, and of strength for all, without exception. That religious differences should not be a reason for exclusion, but rather an opportunity for learning and respect. Now, by sharing this journey, I invite you to put yourself in my place, to feel with me each emotion, each moment of struggle and overcoming. This story continues, and what is to come will reveal even greater challenges I faced and the strength I had to find within myself to keep believing. Leave your comment reflecting on what you've heard so far. How would you react if you were in my place? Do you believe faith should unite, or can it be a cause for division? Your participation is part of the dialogue we need to open in order to transform this reality. From the moment I realized the priest's rejection, I knew that situation would not go unanswered. The pain of exclusion still pulsed in my chest, but alongside it was born a flame, small yet persistent. The flame of justice, the deep desire to show that love and compassion can never be selective. I knew I had to give voice to what I had lived through, to make the world understand that no one deserves to be left behind because of their faith, that true love does not choose whom to reach. It simply reaches. I began looking for ways to expose my experience, even aware of the risks. Many might not want to listen, some might even try to silence my pain, but I could not remain silent. I tried to speak with other patients, family members, and health professionals, seeking allies, people capable of understanding that this religious exclusion was not an isolated case, but rather a reflection of a deeper, systemic problem. It did not take long to realize that my story was just one among many. Stories of doors that closed, glances that turned away, words that, though never spoken aloud, wounded silently. From that moment, my struggle was no longer mine alone. I began to feel part of something larger, a collective voice seeking respect, dignity, and above all, justice. I decided I would not remain silent. I would not allow my suffering to be ignored or swept under the rug of indifference. I imagined what could happen if this situation emerged from the shadows of the hospital and reached religious leaders, authorities, and society at large. Perhaps there lay the beginning of a change that many people desperately needed. Internally, however, it was not easy to cope. My feelings were conflicted and complex. I felt anger, yes, for having been rejected, for having been denied a basic right. I felt sadness, because part of me still believed in the purity of religious love. I also felt hope, and at the same time, the desire to forgive. How do you forgive someone who turned their back on you? How do you continue to believe in faith when confronted so starkly with human failure? I understood that the true test was not against my illness, but against my own ability to keep loving, to keep believing even when love was not returned. This duality consumed me day after day. I reflected on human nature, on the imperfections and contradictions that can exist even within sacred spaces, where faith should be a reason for unity and not for division. Still, I found myself caught in a greater conflict, one that surpassed the walls of the hospital and touched on values I had once thought were universal. Seeking strength to act, I began reaching out to groups of people who also faced religious exclusion, whether in hospitals, communities, or other environments. In those groups, I found solidarity, understanding, and a renewed strength to keep fighting. The exchange of experiences not only brought comfort, but also strengthened that silent movement, crying out for respect and inclusion everywhere. My story began to take life beyond the hospital walls. Accounts and messages started to circulate. News of my experience reached people I had never imagined. Eventually, I received an unexpected invitation. I was asked to meet with members of the priest's church. It was the moment of confrontation, of exposing my feelings, of seeking answers that had yet to come. The tension was palpable, and I could feel my heart racing. I mentally prepared each word I would speak, each argument I would use to show that faith cannot serve as an excuse for intolerance. I imagined how it might unfold. Would this courage be praised, or would the resistance be even stronger? I did not know for sure, but I was determined to face whatever came in the name of truth and love. The meeting was filled with intense emotion. I told my story in detail, showing how that act of exclusion had wounded not only my body, already weakened by illness, but also my soul thirsting for compassion. I exposed how the rejection reflected a larger problem that affects many people and must be discussed and addressed seriously. I noticed that even among those who held faith as their compass, there was resistance to admitting that human flaws could turn the sacred into a source of pain and division. Yet I also saw sparks of hope during the confrontation. Discussions began to arise about the need to change attitudes, to teach that true faith knows no walls or barriers, that the love taught in sacred temples must be greater than any difference. Promises were made of reflection, of seeking concrete changes, even if small, so that future situations like mine would not be repeated. It was a transformative experience that incredibly strengthened my determination. Every obstacle faced, every word spoken or heard, made me stronger. Each small victory reminded me that despite the pain, hope is greater than any rejection. As I write this part of my story to share with you, I feel both the weight and the lightness of this journey. The weight of the injustices I suffered, the lightness of the strength I find in telling and fighting. I believe this narrative can be a path toward reflection, toward awakening awareness, and perhaps toward building bridges where today only walls stand. I want to invite you, who have followed me, to reflect with me. How would you react in such a situation? What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Your voice and your experience are also essential for this conversation. This is the beginning of a struggle that is far from over, but that already shows change is possible when we dare to face what seems impossible. The fight for respect and dignity continues, and I invite you to continue with me to discover what comes next. After all, this is not just my story. It is the story of many who long to be seen and heard. Please leave your comment, your experiences, and your thoughts. Let's build this narrative together so that love and inclusion prevail over every form of exclusion and prejudice. The journey continued, but the feeling of exclusion I experienced in the hospital was not limited to that painful moment alone. Little by little, I began to realize that the rejection was not confined to the priest who refused to visit me. That closed door echoed symbolically in many other places, manifesting itself in silent attitudes and sometimes explicit actions that reinforced the invisible barrier between different beliefs. It was as if a veil of intolerance hovered over the environment, threatening the very essence of faith and welcome. In the days that followed, I began to hear accounts, few at first, that circulated through the hospital and the community. Stories of patients who went through similar situations, people who had also been left aside, ignored, or even ridiculed for professing a belief different from the dominant one in that place. Some experiences were as cruel as mine, like that of the elderly lady whose religious symbols were removed and thrown away, an affront not only to her faith, but also to her identity. These narratives made me see that I was not alone. There was a network of exclusion that needed to be dismantled. I wondered how something as fundamental as spiritual assistance, which should be a right guaranteed to all regardless of belief, could be denied so coldly and inhumanely. Federal law known. 9,982, 2,000 guarantees, freedom of belief and access to religious assistance in hospitals, but daily practice often contradicts this right, revealing a culture of intolerance that must be overcome. I reflected deeply on what this meant for me, and for so many others seeking comfort in their faith during times of suffering. It was during this period that I realized the importance of telling my story, not only for myself, but for all those who face this kind of discrimination. I saw that silence was not an option, for it only fueled the perpetuation of injustice. I decided to become an active voice, fragile though it might be, in the fight against religious intolerance, seeking to open space for dialogue and change. Courage, though difficult to find each day, was born of the need to transform pain into action. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, the challenges continued. The relationship with the medical and administrative staff was not always easy, for many seemed bound by protocols and prejudices that hindered true plural spiritual care. In some cases, the lack of empathy and understanding created silent conflicts that corroded the self-esteem of patients and their families. I saw how bureaucracy and fear of the different could become obstacles in a place meant for healing. My family and friends were fundamental in supporting me through this trial, but I knew the issue went far beyond my personal case. Religious exclusion reverberated in every corner where people sought comfort in faith, and the lack of respect for diverse beliefs caused deep emotional wounds. I thought of countless others who, like me, perhaps lacked the courage to speak, who felt invisible and rejected, suffering in silence. Some moments were particularly painful when attempts to bring religious leaders from other denominations to visit patients were denied or hindered by internal rules or intolerant attitudes. I kept thinking about how these basic rights are, in practice, so often disrespected, generating feelings of helplessness and abandonment. The fine line between respecting differences and imposing a single religious standard was crossed daily amid stories of exclusion and pain. Yet amid all this, I found people willing to listen, to embrace, and to fight for change. Support groups, lawyers, community leaders, and patients began to share their experiences and coordinate efforts to demand more dignified and inclusive treatment. It was a network that grew and strengthened me, showing that the fight against religious intolerance is also a fight for humanity and respect. Looking back on those moments, I cannot help but be moved by the resilience that arose amid the difficulties. I learned that true faith is manifested not only in rituals and words, but in respect for others, in empathy, and in the ability to listen and embrace the different. This lesson accompanied me and motivated me to keep going, even when everything seemed determined to bring me down. Each day was also a new challenge to maintain physical and mental health amid this emotional storm. My body, weakened by illness, required constant care, and my mind, even more vulnerable, needed special attention to withstand the weight of exclusion. The intersection of physical health with spirituality was evident, and I felt the importance of comprehensive and respectful assistance that contemplated every aspect of the human being. Meanwhile, in my pursuit of justice and respect, I faced moments of confrontation, pressure, and even veiled threats, but also moments of acceptance and hope. I was invited to participate in meetings and debates aimed at reformulating internal policies and raising awareness of the importance of religious diversity in both public and private health spaces. This struggle, though long and arduous, was essential to ensure that no one else would have to go through what I did. The growing recognition of the right to plural religious assistance and the fight against intolerance are fundamental steps toward building a more just and inclusive society. Today, I revisit these experiences not only as a survivor, but as a tireless advocate for the rights of religious minorities. This story I share is much more than my personal account. It is a call for collective reflection and action, an invitation for each of us to become agents of change and to contribute to a world where faith is synonymous with love, respect, and inclusion. Now I invite everyone following this narrative to reflect on their own attitudes and on the impact that individual actions can have on another's life. Think of how many times a gesture of acceptance or respect can transform a reality of suffering into a path of hope. Leave here your opinion, your questions, your stories. This conversation is fundamental so that together we can tear down the barriers of intolerance and build strong bridges of understanding and love among religions. And this fight does not stop here. The next chapter will reveal the unfolding of this journey, the most intense confrontations, and the victories that, despite fatigue and pain, continue to fuel our hope. Don't miss it. I will never forget the day I finally faced head-on the deepest pain that journey had brought me. It was the moment I marked as the climax of my struggle, a direct, intense, and emotion-filled confrontation, where I not only had to cry out my truth, but also seek answers to the countless questions that tormented me. It was the day when, even while feeling the weight of rejection, I decided I would not remain silent, that I needed to show everyone what it means to feel excluded and invisible in such a delicate moment as illness. The chosen place for this meeting was the hospital itself, the stage of my greatest afflictions, where I had lived days of isolation, anguish, and distance. I arrived surrounded by a mixture of fear, hope, and determination. Time seemed to move slowly as I waited to be called into that decisive meeting, where I would face religious leaders, hospital staff, and institutional representatives responsible for ensuring the right to spiritual assistance. My heart pounded hard, reflecting every quickened breath, every drop of cold sweat running down my forehead. As I waited, I dove inside myself, recalling vivid scenes. The silent rejection I felt when the priest learned I belonged to another church, the doors that closed, the eyes that turned away, the crushing sense of being seen as different and therefore less deserving of care and attention. Those memories gave me strength to go on, to fight against barriers that seemed insurmountable. But the story was not mine alone. Many other voices echoed in my mind, voices of patients who had gone through similar experiences, victims of painful and unjust exclusion, like the woman who, diagnosed with a serious illness, had her Afro-Brazilian religious objects removed and discarded without respect, or the young man who, rejected by traditional religious leaders, found in his early walk of faith only solitude and incomprehension. These stories, shared in casual conversations and exchanged messages, showed me that intolerance is not an isolated occurrence, but an alarmingly widespread phenomenon. What shocked me most was the contradiction between legal norms and everyday practice. The Federal Constitution of Brazil guarantees the right to religious freedom and mandates that spiritual care must be assured to everyone in hospitals. Yet the reality we face is different. The system often privileges a homogeneous vision of faith, excluding those who do not fit the dominant standard. I can say this battle was not only about my health, but also about the struggle for dignity, rights, and recognition. When I was finally called into the meeting room, I felt my breath falter for a moment. It was time to present my pains and anguishes, to make the invisible visible. My speech began timidly, but gained strength as I shared my experience. I spoke of the emptiness I felt in my soul when denied spiritual comfort, of the loneliness that deepened with every door closed to me. Speaking all this was not easy. Emotion overwhelmed me, and my tear-filled eyes betrayed the weight of my story. There were questions from those present, from professionals who claimed to be acting under institutional protocols, to religious leaders defending the maintenance of traditions and internal rules. Yet I also found a group willing to reflect, to rethink their attitudes, and to recognize the importance of a more inclusive and respectful service. We discussed possible changes, ways to promote awareness, and above all the commitment not to repeat the failures I had witnessed. It was an intense dialogue where ambivalence was constant. On one side, the obstacle of rigidity and prejudice. On the other, the hope of transformation that could guarantee, not only for me, but for thousands of others, the right to comfort and spiritual assistance. This social and institutional resistance was nothing new, but it was certainly a blow to my spirit to realize how difficult it was to break with such deep-rooted structures. After the meeting, I left with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of mission accomplished. I knew that planting that seed was essential so that one day religious intolerance would lose its grip in an environment that should be sacred to everyone. In the weeks that followed, My story began to circulate on social networks and in discussion groups, raising awareness and amplifying the conversation about respect for religious diversity. I received messages of support, accounts from other victims, and statements from religious leaders engaged in the cause of inclusion. This silent yet growing mobilization showed me that even amid difficulties, collective strength can bring about real change. However, resistance and attacks also came. I became the target of criticism, attempts to discredit me, and even veiled threats meant to silence me. This duality made me understand that the struggle is long, exhausting, and requires constant courage. Even with all these challenges, I kept my faith intact, a faith renewed by the understanding that it goes far beyond religious practices. It is an act of courage, love, and resistance. Now I see that the true test of faith is precisely to remain steadfast, even in the face of the greatest adversities. In my journey, the solidarity I found, the voices that joined mine, and the hope for justice renewed my strength to keep moving forward. As I share all this with you, I want to invite you to reflect on the power of small actions, on how respect for diversity can transform realities and promote a more just, inclusive, and compassionate world. Think of how many lives can be positively impacted if we choose empathy and acceptance. Leave your comment here. Share your experience, your opinion, your story. Your engagement is vital, so that together we can build a society that respects all forms of faith and promotes love without distinctions. Prepare yourself for the next and final chapter of this intense story, which will bring the conclusion of this struggle and a powerful reflection on forgiveness, justice, and redemption. Don't miss it. The pain I felt at that moment seemed to carry the weight of an entire system. What began as an individual rejection turned into a struggle for justice and respect that would eventually cross far greater boundaries. After the initial confrontation I had with those responsible for my exclusion and for the exclusion of other patients, I realized my journey was part of a collective battle faced by thousands across the country. I was not alone, and that gave me strength to keep going. I came to understand that the rejection I had initially felt so personally was, in truth, a concrete manifestation of religious intolerance that still permeates many public spaces, especially hospitals. Stories like mine are not exceptions. They are painfully present in the lives of many, particularly those who practice Afro-Brazilian religions or other minority faiths. I remembered the case of Tainá de Osumare, a young patient who, while undergoing cancer treatment, saw her sacred symbols disrespected and thrown away by hospital staff. Her indignation and suffering struck me deeply, for it was a pain much like my own. The very purpose of those who should be agents of love and care, like the priest who refused to visit me, was emptied by prejudices that sadly still dominate sectors of our society. Bureaucracy, rigid protocols, ingrained beliefs, and silent prejudice turned hospitals into places that at times seemed to have no room for religious plurality. Often, even health professionals themselves are unaware of the importance of spiritual care in a patient's recovery, which is not only physical but also emotional and spiritual. I felt the weight of this reality on my skin and in my soul. I heard accounts of patients who were prevented from receiving visits from leaders of other faiths or whose religious traditions were disregarded. Entire families were forced to fight exhausting battles to guarantee their loved ones the right to spiritual assistance. This chain of exclusion only deepens the invisibility of religious minorities. The feeling of injustice fueled my will to fight, but with it came fear. I knew that facing such a deeply rooted system would require persistence and courage. There were moments of weakness and profound doubts. Would my voice be heard? Would my struggle lead to something greater? Or would it be swallowed by silence? Fear of the consequences haunted me, yet the sense that I could contribute to change kept me firm. This phase of my journey was marked by long conversations, meetings in support groups, and participation in debates and seminars dedicated to promoting diversity and religious respect in healthcare institutions. I listened to more stories like mine, each with its own nuances, yet all carrying the same plea: recognition, dignity, and justice. Along the way, I found valuable allies, healthcare professionals trained in humanization who understood the importance of spirituality in healing, religious leaders of different denominations willing to build collaborative bridges, activists and jurists who supported initiatives to provoke changes in public policies and internal practices within health institutions. This network of support grew and strengthened the conviction that inclusion is a right, not a concession. Faith, which had always been my refuge, became also an active force, a motor for resistance and social transformation. I understood that true spirituality cannot be confined by rigid dogmas, but must embrace human diversity in all its complexity, welcoming, respecting and loving others regardless of differences. But I will not lie. There were dark times, days when the weight of the struggle seemed unbearable. In the hospital, my body was weakened by illness and my mind oppressed by exclusion. Sometimes the silence of the room amplified my doubts and sorrows. The feeling of being invisible and unprotected was a constant shadow, and questions hammered at my mind. Does my suffering serve any purpose? Will my story make a difference? Despite these hardships, hope was never extinguished. Small gestures of solidarity, words of encouragement, and the collective sense of struggle renewed my strength. I learned that to resist is a form of love, not only for myself, but for all those who face similar challenges. Throughout this journey, I began to document my experiences in words, trying to give voice to such a complex and painful reality. Writing became a channel of catharsis, and also a way of reaching hearts and minds for reflection and change. Stories shared on social media, discussions and debates that emerged showed that religious intolerance, even when silent, causes deep wounds that must be faced with courage. I also came to see the importance of public policies and education in human rights and religious diversity to combat this structural prejudice. Hundreds of reports show that the fight against intolerance must be a national priority, for it involves the dignity and fundamental rights of citizens, especially those belonging to religious minorities. This collective resistance, though difficult, is a light at the end of the tunnel. A light capable of transforming exclusion into inclusion, rejection into welcome, prejudice into respect. A light that inspires me every day not to give up. Now that I have shared these moments and reflections, I extend an invitation to you who have followed my story. Why don't we make a difference together? Let us reflect on our own prejudices, attitudes, and open space for dialogue and empathy in our society. Respect for another's faith is the foundation for peaceful and enriching coexistence, and this is only the beginning of transformation. In the next chapter, we will reach the conclusion of this difficult and moving story, a moment of justice, forgiveness, and profound reflection that will certainly stir emotions and provoke thought. So please leave here your comment, your opinion, your questions, and share your own stories as well. Join this network that seeks to spread love and respect, for together we are stronger to change what must be changed. The conclusion of my story was not just an ending, but a new chapter, a rebirth marked by justice, forgiveness, and transformation. Everything I lived through in the corridors of that hospital, from the initial rejection to the relentless fight for recognition and respect, taught me lessons far beyond anything I could have imagined. It was finally time to look back with courage and to look forward with hope. Throughout my struggle, I realized that true faith reveals itself not only in prayer or in attending a temple, but in the capacity to love others fully, respecting their differences and embracing their uniqueness. This understanding was a decisive turning point, for it challenged me to overcome deep wounds and to find in spirituality an unshakable source of strength. The justice I had long awaited began to take shape in unexpected ways. The hospital administration, moved by the complaints and the support of diverse voices, began reviewing its internal protocols, guaranteeing universal access to spiritual assistance. Professionals started receiving training on religious diversity and the right to freedom of belief, ensuring that no one would again be denied or excluded in moments of vulnerability. In practice, this meant that patients of all faiths could finally receive visits from their spiritual leaders, take part in rituals, and express their beliefs without fear or shame. This change did not happen overnight. It was the result of difficult dialogues, persistence, and courage, but it became a beacon for other institutions to follow and implement similar practices. But for me, the conclusion would not be complete without speaking of forgiveness. At the beginning of my journey, that word seemed distant, almost unreachable, as wounded emotions weighed heavily upon my spirit. Yet over time, and through everything I had lived, I came to understand that forgiving is not forgetting, nor minimizing the gravity of what happened. It is a conscious act of liberation. Forgiveness allowed me to release the weight of resentment I had carried for so long and to make space for inner peace. It was a fundamental step in my emotional and spiritual healing, a gesture of self-love that paradoxically also became a gift to those who had wronged me, because forgiveness breaks the cycle of hatred and rejection. Reflecting on forgiveness also led me to re-examine my faith, discovering in it new meanings and possibilities. I realized that true spirituality is not confined to dogmas or rituals, but resides in the practice of unconditional love, in the constant pursuit of justice, and in the courage to rebuild bridges where there had once been division. Beyond the personal impact, my journey gained another dimension, that of social advocacy. I understood that my experience, both painful and transformative, could serve as an instrument to inspire change in other people and institutions. That is why I became actively involved in projects that promote religious diversity and inclusion in healthcare, education, and public policy. This mission has led me to take part in events, lectures, and meetings aimed at raising awareness among leaders and communities about the value of spiritual plurality. I believe social transformation depends on our collective commitment to respect diversity and ensure that the right to spiritual assistance becomes a lived reality for everyone, without exception. In conversations with people of different faiths, I notice that faith is, in its essence, a unifying force, not a dividing one. This truth must be reclaimed and lived out every day, especially in places as delicate as hospitals, where human vulnerability demands complete care of body, mind, and soul. Building this new vision of faith and respectful coexistence was not an isolated task. I received the support of many friends, family members, fellow fighters, and professionals committed to the holistic well-being of human beings. This network of solidarity is essential to effectively fight intolerance and to ensure that love prevails. Reflecting on this journey, I also recognize how vital education is in combating prejudice and building a culture of respect. The training of healthcare and education professionals must include dialogue about religious diversity, human rights, and empathy, so that future generations may grow up in a more just and welcoming world. My story is an invitation for each of us to become agents of transformation, committed to promoting peace and respect. After all, we have all been at some point in a position of vulnerability, needing care and understanding. By sharing this account with you, who have followed this journey, I hope to have planted a seed of reflection and action. May we together build a world where faith is synonymous with love and unity, where differences are celebrated as treasures, and where no one suffers exclusion because of their belief. And what can I say about the future? That it depends on the choices we make today, choices that can turn small gestures into silent revolutions, that can open doors instead of closing them, that can open hearts instead of wounding them. The narrative I share does not end here. It becomes part of a greater story, one that grows and unfolds in every person who chooses to act with respect and love. I invite all of you to join in this work, bringing your voices, stories, and hopes into this vital and ongoing dialogue. Finally, I want to thank you who took the time to listen to this story. Your willingness to reflect and engage is already proof that change is possible. Stay with me on this path, in this fight for dignity, for faith, and for love that transcends all boundaries. Leave your comment, share your experience, your questions, and your feelings. This is a conversation that must continue, so that together we can ensure that respect for religious diversity becomes a reality for all, especially for those who need it most. Thus, we close this stage, but we remain open to all that is still to come. May love and justice always be our guides. In that final stage of my journey, every small gesture and every word spoken in the name of justice seemed to carry an unimaginable weight. The changes achieved in the very place where I had endured most of my pain held a meaning that went beyond the simple revision of protocols or a formal apology. For me, they represented the recognition of human dignity and the respect that must be assured to everyone, especially those most in need of care and compassion. I vividly recall the conversations in the hospital corridors, where the protagonists of change discussed not only procedures, but also the fundamental values that should guide how we treat one another. I felt that, despite the many challenges, the path I had walked was beginning to shine with the hope of a future where exclusion would gradually be replaced by inclusion, and where religious differences would be celebrated as part of the cultural richness that defines us. More than ever, this experience awakened in me the awareness that faith cannot be used as a justification for division or rejection. I came to a deep understanding that true spirituality lies in tolerance, in unconditional love, and in the ethical commitment to respect every individual's freedom to believe in their own way, whatever that belief may be. Even today, I continue to work so that this transformation may grow, taking part in initiatives that promote religious diversity and inclusion within healthcare institutions and community spaces. I see it as essential to foster open and ongoing dialogue between different religions, community leaders, healthcare professionals, and civil society, so that effective policies can be built to guarantee the right to spiritual assistance for everyone. These actions, however, are not simple. They face deeply rooted resistance, fears, and prejudices passed down through generations, requiring a collective effort of education, awareness, and mobilization. For me, this process of social transformation is an extension of my own spiritual journey, where the practice of faith translates into concrete actions of love and justice. During this time, I also learned the value of solidarity and empathy. I gained unexpected allies, people who had once been unaware of the challenges faced by religious minorities, but who became moved and began working to promote change. They showed me that anyone can be an agent of transformation, a multiplier of the respect and love we must cultivate in order to build a fairer society. The story I share is also an invitation for each person to reflect on their own relationship with diversity. May we examine our prejudices, our habits, and our words, and may we, together, foster a culture of dialogue and understanding. Only then can we build bridges that allow harmonious coexistence, that celebrate our differences, and that elevate our humanity. At this moment, I invite you to think about the importance of respect in everyday life, in schools, in families, in workplaces. How can small attitudes make an enormous difference? How can respect for another's faith be the first step toward a more inclusive and peaceful world? As I close this final stage, I cannot fail to express my deep gratitude To the friends, family, healthcare professionals, and activists who walked with me and who continue to fight so that everyone has their rights respected. They were true pillars of strength and inspiration. My faith is now a beacon that guides me in the mission of building bridges, of promoting inclusion, and of honoring the diversity that enriches us as human beings. It is no longer only an individual refuge, but a communal force of change, solidarity, and hope. And it is with this conviction that I close this narrative, open to the challenges, lessons, and victories yet to come. After all, the fight against religious intolerance is not an endpoint. It is an ongoing commitment, a chapter always open in the history of humanity. I would like this story to be an invitation for you to join this journey of respect, love, and faith. Leave your comment, share your experience, your questions, and your dreams for a future where exclusion gives way to inclusion, and where faith becomes the force that unites. The story ends here, but the journey continues. May love and justice be our constant companions.